You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. My guest today is Deborah O'Neill, who has been Senator for New South Wales since 2013. She is a member of the Australian Labor Party and formerly represented the seat of Robertson as a member of the House of Representatives from 2010 to 2013. Before entering federal parliament, Deborah was a high school teacher on the Central Coast for the best part of 3 decades. She is passionate about ensuring all Australian men and women, regardless of their circumstances, have access to secure work, income, and a world-class health and education system. Senator O'Neill, welcome to Talking Freely.
Well, good morning, Ron. It's lovely to be speaking with you.
The media has presented your religious freedom advocacy as kind of going out on a limb. After years of representing the electorate of Robertson and now New South Wales in the Senate, how important, in your view, are religious freedom issues both to the Australian people and to the Australian Labor Party?
That's such a great question, Ron. Thank you so much for asking me my view, because this perception of me going out on a limb is one I sort of relish the opportunity to critique, because being in a Labor Party is an expression of my faith. It always has been. And there are people of faith in my own tradition and from other Christian traditions and from the Islamic faith and from the Jewish faith who are vibrant and active a part of the Labor Party, both at branch level, state level, and within the federal caucus itself. So this limb dancing that I'm supposed to be doing, I suppose, it's a little bit of a shock to me to have it described as that way, because that's not my lived experience, and it doesn't actually resonate with how I feel about the interconnectedness of faith and being part of the Labor Party.
And how important, in your view, is religious freedom as an issue in general to the people of Australia?
Well, now that's a very interesting thing to think about, because I don't know that the Australian people think in issues about politics. I think most people just experience politics through sort of these general, the milieu of the society in which we live. And I think for so many Australians, just the capacity to proclaim their faith, whether they do it in a devout way or in the way that I would describe myself, more of a garden variety adherent to the faith, it's just a part of who we are. It's part of who we've always been. And I think it's important to think about, our First Nations brothers and sisters and the sense of spirituality and the expression of faith in the numinous that's part of the world that they lived in here in Australia for millennia. So the idea that you talk about faith as an element of politics, to me, while it's interesting as a politician, I don't think that Australians really think about it generally in that way. It's just a part of any healthy society, in my view. Clearly, there have been times in history where it's been more to the forefront of conversations. And I think for me, the issues about faith have less to do with being a Catholic in Australia and more to do with, my understanding of the importance of faith and how important it is to protect freedom of choice to live your faith. Really comes from my experience of schooling and history and an understanding of the Holocaust through literature and also through teaching religion in schools in a phenomenological way in Catholic schools to raise awareness about the multi-faith world in which we live. So if I can, I'd like to sort of share a story with you about how I came to know about the Holocaust. When I was growing up in Australia, books were a lot more expensive than they are today. And there weren't a lot of books in the house that I grew up. My parents really supported me in my education, but there weren't bookshelves and there weren't many books around. And there were children's books, but not a lot that I could read. And I wanted to read. So one day through the school newsletter, there was a little note to my parents, and it was that we could buy a book. And I went off to school with, I remember it was a note in my hand. I don't know if it was $5 or $10, but I had a note, and I was able to buy a book. So when I got to the book stand, I had a really good look for one that was pretty thick, because that was going to be good value for money, and I would be able to read it over a longer period of time. And I ended up choosing a book that I still have to this day, and it was called Our Lady's Fool. That book was actually about a saint whose name is Saint Maximilian Kolbe. And I didn't know anything of him before I read this book. And I have to say, at school, I didn't really hear very much about him as a saint. And the first time I actually ever saw an image of Maximilian Kolbe that I can recall was here at the cathedral in Canberra, where there's a beautiful stained glass window which has a likeness of St. Maximilian Kolbe. So you can imagine in this house in Grandview Avenue, Toongabbie, with these Irish immigrant parents who had left school, at the end of primary school and in the middle of high school for my mum. And you've got a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, perhaps I was at the time, reading a book about a saint who was sainted because he put himself forward to be sacrificed in a concentration camp when a man with children was going to be killed. So apparently the story, as I recall it, was that this man who had children would likely be killed in a Nazi concentration camp. And when the call went out for this man can live if somebody will step forward, the person who stepped forward was St. Maximilian Kolbe. So that was my understanding. And I was trying to ask my parents at the time, how could that happen? And what's a concentration camp? And the whole concept that there could be such evil in the world and that this could happen was a pretty shocking awakening to the world. And I suppose it's a lesson to parents to have a really good look at the books that you allow your children to read, because what opened up there for me was a whole lot of questions about the way in which faith works, and a lot of questions about history. And that sort of inquisitorial sense of how did this happen, how could it happen, just stayed with me as I went through the course of my life. And I don't know that I got a lot of answers to my questions, but pretty shortly afterwards, friends of ours had an old, I think it was Newman's encyclopedia. It was pretty out of date, but they ended up giving that to my parents, and I was able to read. So I had a lot of time and capacity to read more, and I read what I was able to from those encyclopedias. But the next really significant encounter that I had was in the form of adolescent fiction, and I know that adolescent fiction as a form really didn't exist too much until the 1960s and 70s, when it really started to emerge. And there was a book called The Silver Sword, and I read that novel. And it was a child's perspective of what had happened in the Second World War. And again, that sort of filled out a little more of my sense of what it was like to grow up in a country where religious persecution was just everywhere. And from my reading and my empathy with the characters who were so displaced in that post-war context, I just had a very, very deep sense of the importance of freedom of religion for people of all faiths from that early part of my life. And that stays with me to this day.
When it comes to the protection of religious freedoms in Australia, do you think such guarantees are also of benefit to Australians who don't have a faith?
Do people of no faith have an understanding of history? Do people of no faith have an understanding of oppression? Do people of no faith have an understanding of democracy? Absolutely, absolutely. And so I think for people of faith and people of no faith, a rich understanding of what living in a democracy means allows people who hold very, very different worldviews to move along in our lives together in this country with space for one another. And I think perhaps that's right where the intersection of conflict about this issue is too often focused. It's often constructed as a binary, people of no faith and people of faith. Well, I want to protect the rights of people of no faith and people of faith right across the spectrum, because that is the reality of living in a vibrant cosmopolitan democracy. All of those people are in our community. And as a person of faith who understands my faith as one of an invitational faith to others, that they see in the way that I live my life imbued with a sense of faith, strengthened with my faith, living a life of faithfulness to what I understand of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that provides a sense to other people that I encounter that my faith is not a threat to them, my faith is not a judgment of them, but my faith is something that can be observed, shared if it's requested, experienced as a fellow traveller along the journey. And through that fullness of living my life as a person of faith, that people of no faith not only see me as no threat, but might say, actually, it's really interesting how she copes with the challenges that come to her. How does she seem not to be troubled by these things? And the answer for me is so much my prayer life, my sense of God's presence in my life, and the strength that gives me. So, yes, I think there's room for people in a democracy of all those different dispositions to have a profound, rich and informed sense of the importance of freedom of faith for all peoples.
Freedom rights are often considered to have an interdependent relationship. Speech, religion, conscience, association, and so on. Does your advocacy of religious freedom within the ALP extend to these other rights as well?
I don't see how they're inseparable. The critical word, I think, that gives voice to the interconnectedness of all of those complex rights conversations that happen is the freedom to manifest one's faith. You know, faith is something that lives with you as a citizen, not only in a private way, but in a public way. And it does provide challenges, I suppose, sometimes when it intersects with other worldviews. But the problem with the rights-based conversation, when it only is contracted down to my right against your right as a contest, is that it takes away the complex reality of human interaction. And I think when we just reduce everything to a rights-based conversation, we've lost something of the greater flavour, the greater river that we all swim in, which is that fundamental understanding of democracy, that there is a rich diversity, there is a rich tapestry of different views, black, white, yellow, grey, orange, pink, blue, the whole catastrophe of all the different colours and all the different flavours that represent a genuinely cosmopolitan democracy in a multicultural Australia in 2021. What I fear when we revert to rights-based language is a failure to actually have that grander narrative that makes space for those differences. When I was teaching, one of the things that we would try to do each year at the beginning of establishing rules and respectful relationships in the classroom was to come up with a set of shared principles that the class could adhere to. And at the end of it, the most important addition that I'd always put on is any right I claim for myself, I extend to you. That's the part of the rights-based conversation that seems to be missing so often in an adversarial description of rights that plays out far too often in the public place, and particularly in media. And this is one of the things that concerns me, that I know now that in the Parliament there are new young journalists who are being put on contracts where part of their remuneration and their KPIs are tied to the number of clicks they get on a story. We know from reading drama and reading literature that conflict is a necessary part of creating a sense of story, and the resolution of that happens naturally in a narrative in some way. But in the media, the clicks are coming for where conflict is most enlivened. And in doing so, I think what happens is the way in which difference is represented in media, different points of view, it very quickly rises to mine against yours, black against white. And there's an embedded sort of sense of superiority of one over another, the goodies versus the baddies. This binarism that is so seductive it does nothing to help a conversation about the reality of lived faith in this country, and the reality of the importance of Australia as a rich and wealthy democracy to take our place not only amongst ourselves in having a richer and more nuanced conversation about that intersection of different perspectives that arise from different world faith perspectives, but it also puts upon Australians a responsibility to take part in advocacy for peoples in other countries who are experiencing incredible discrimination on the basis of faith. And I'm thinking, particularly of the Uyghur people and the very real debate that is now happening about the genocide that's happening to the Uyghur people because of the actions of the Chinese Communist Party. So I guess there's lots of strands in terms of the way in which we need to be talking about religion. And I think all people of faith or no faith who are responsible citizens are really called upon to have a basic understanding of the major traditions of faith across the world, to understand and not forget the lessons of the Holocaust, and remembering the 6 million, and sadly the many who have since died in faith conflicts across the world, that we are able to do better in understanding one another and accepting faith as a fundamental human right, and differentiation in the way faith can be lived as an enhancement to the way lives are lived on this planet, rather than a cause for contest, division and derision.
In a cultural landscape of competing rights that you've just touched on, how is it that religious freedom can be meaningfully upheld?
Well, I think that religious freedom and all freedoms can only be meaningfully upheld and discussed if there is a bargain basement version of people's understanding of democracy. And I think that this is an issue that's starting to actually have some resonance. What is it to be a citizen? What is it to be part of a civil society? What is it that democracy gives us that is of such value that we should really carefully uphold it? And I think about the contest of ideas that is part of the previous century around democracy and the defence of democracy that's embedded in, the Second World War, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Cold War and other conflicts of ideologies that cost so many lives. Democracy is for me essentially based on a radical concept that each person is of profoundly equal value and dignity, and that dignity has nothing to do with any physical manifestation that the world might seek to classify you by. You have no less or more dignity because you're a man or a woman. You have no less or more dignity in the eyes of my God and my version of faith because of the color of your skin or the imperfections of your body, or the age of your body, or the capacity of your body. All of humanity, in my Catholic informed view of the world, is an expression of God's grace. And I see in every human person, through my eyes of faith, the flame of God's gift of creation. I see it in the natural world as well, but I profoundly see, for me, God revealing himself every day in the people in whom I have, the people with whom I have encounters. And I can't meet everybody on the planet, but I can begin with the idea that every person is unique and that their diversity is a representation of gift, not liability. So when I begin there, democracy is an easy fit for me because it relies on that fundamental principle. And I think back to, my reading of the gospel and the stories about who was in the in group and who was in the out group. I did attend St. Patrick's College, Campbelltown, which was a Catholic girls' school, which was established in that building at that time by the Good Samaritan sisters. And the parable of the Good Samaritan really is very, very instructive for me. That good deeds are done by people who don't worship alongside me. I'm being very, very aware of that for a very, very long time. And it concerns me sometimes that communities of faith essentially retreat behind the walls and pull up the drawbridge and move to a model of exclusivism and articulate a version of faith that puts them above and beyond others, and that judgment flows from that. I don't think we can allow that kind of faith practice to be uncritiqued, because it needs to fit into a democracy where you hold your faith firmly, at the same time make space for others who hold a different worldview. Not to resile from your own faith, not to walk away from it in any way, but to leave enough space for the numinous, for what I call God, and what an Islamic person might call Allah, what a Jewish person might call Yahweh, what an Indian Hindu person or a Sikh might name differently. But that sense of the numinous, that's part of life. I find it pretty interesting that Buddhism has had such a significant rise amongst Australians over the course of the last few decades, because it's less to do with a sense of, a deity, and more to do with perhaps an alternative to the 10 Commandments. And I think about the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, and the call that it has on people who adhere to Buddhist philosophies and beliefs to live a good life, to practice right speech, practice right thought. And maybe that's an interesting way of, shifting away from rights as an individual thing to be asserted, claimed and contested against other competing rights to, right speech, right thought, some moral imperative that finds its roots in the great faith of democracy, which is a deep and abiding belief in the equality of all human persons. I think that's the bit of the conversation that is too often missing in the rights-based discussions that we have.
You consulted various institutions, including Freedom for Faith, for feedback on the Labor Party's latest draft policy platform. What was the result of your efforts when you presented this feedback of religious communities at caucus?
Oh, look, it was such a joyful experience to actually spend the time having conversation. And as I've found throughout the whole of my life, interactions with people of faith and communities of faith, such a wide range of perspectives and experiences, a richness of encounter with the Australian community that was brought to conversation. The actual integrity of all of the faith groups that I spoke with, in terms of their dedication to actually reading through the entire 80 pages, line for line, word for word, and coming to a conversation so carefully prepared to say what they thought about what Labor's vision for a fairer, more equitable Australia was just a fantastic experience. And I delighted in receiving from so many people the commentary that so much in this platform, the Labor platform, resonates with us as people of faith. So much. And that was from the Islamic community. It was from the Christian community, all the different denominations. It was from Islamic people. It was from the representatives of the Hindu community, of the Sikh community, also of representatives of the Buddhist community. It was just really, really amazing to have that sense of, when unmediated interaction between people of faith and the Labor Party platform, which is an expression of our beliefs, our principles, and our vision for how to bring a fairer and more economically just Australia into being, people of faith definitely saw themselves in Labor's platform, in Labor's policies. Interestingly, when Labor's policies are selectively pulled apart and pushed out into the media, they fall victim to, that process that I was talking about, where the goodies and the baddies, in terms of protectors of faith and non-protectors of faith, the goodies and the baddies in terms of any issue with regard to religious practice, gets played out in the media. And I just think it's ridiculous that an entire political party that's filled with people of faith, such as the Labor Party, was able to be so mischaracterised in the 2019 election. And I guess that's part of why I felt called to reconnect and to re-establish conversations to make it clear, in a way that clearly was not the case in 2019, that Labor has always had people of faith in our midst, that Labor absolutely believes in the freedom of religion as a basic tenet of a healthy democracy, that Labor, both in government and out of government, over decades has been part of the establishment and the continuing chorus of voices around the world, internationally, for the protection of freedom of religious expression and manifestation of freedom. Putting those ongoing historical commitments into words in our platform, so that there can be no doubt about that, really has been a joyful experience for me. And if I can compare the way in which Labor expresses our deep beliefs through this entire process of, a national policy conference that's preceded by a long year of consultation with civic society and with our own branches and our branch members and unions and legal advocates and peak groups. We've pulled all of that together to give voice in black and white, so that Australians can actually see who we are. And in terms of the draft platform that is proceeding to our national conference, we've made it pretty clear, in a way I think that now is incontrovertible, that Labor absolutely will protect and promote the right to freedom of thought and conscience and religion. And we do that in accordance with Australia's long-standing international obligations, to which Labor, as a party of government, have been signatory, and have been actively in pursuit of, both in Australia and internationally. And we have those obligations as a nation under Article 18 and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have obligations that Labor is absolutely aware of, has always been aware of, and is committed to making sure we uphold.
When you look across all sides of politics, across the political spectrum, what is your sense about a genuine desire to protect religious freedom?
Look, I think the protection of religious freedom for all parties is a requirement of certainly being part of the government if you become the government, but also for all parliamentarians, again, on the basis that parliamentarians absolutely must have a robust understanding of democracy and the importance of having the full range of views of the society that we represent there on the floor of Parliament in both the House and the Senate. The sense that one particular party might have purchase on religion as an issue is just completely at odds with the reality of my lived experience as a member of the Labor Party for 25 years and as a member of the Labor Party federal caucus over the last 10 years. And I'm quite offended, actually, sometimes by people's representation that the Labor Party is a place absent of people of faith. That diminishes all of us in the Labor Party, people of faith, people who express that faith in a public way, people who express it very privately, people who hold no faith but have a deep and rich understanding of the importance of faith in society, people who are the products of faith-based education, whose values arose from the stories, the sacred stories and experience that they had there that are reinforced now and manifest themselves in Labor Party policy. It's sometimes really offensive to have people from one political party weaponise faith against people of faith across the full range of our political parties, and to make it hard for people, who support even like the Greens Party or independents to stand up and say, yeah, hold on, like I'm a person of faith too. Are you going to make it impossible for me to stand up and say I'm a person of faith if I belong to a particular party? How does that advance the cause of religious freedom? If one party, the Liberal National Party in particular, tries to claim that as its its own political mandate, that diminishes all people of faith. And I think we need to protect against that in a big way.
Leader of the opposition, Anthony Albanese, recently spoke with various Christian community leaders, remarking on the ways Labor Party values are aligned with Christian values. Can religious people in Australia rely on Labor to support a religious discrimination bill, particularly in light of the recent Victorian conversion therapy bill that seems to reach into the very prayer lives of people of faith?
Look, I think Anthony's comments should be believed absolutely. That Labor understands the place of faith in people's lives, and that religious freedom and the capacity to manifest your faith, as I've said, is something that Labor believes in. As a political party, the necessary protections for people to manifest their faith are absolutely understood. One of the things that concerns me is, there's so much that concerns me about the way in which this faith proposition continues to be shifted to partisan politics, is a misunderstanding, I think, of the way in which the community needs to engage or can engage with politicians. If communities of faith are convinced by media that they don't have a place in a particular party, the whole community is diminished. Christians of faith in particular have, to a degree, I think, felt colonised and been colonised in a partisan political way by the Liberal National Party. I don't think that helps the cause of people of all faith. So I'm really heartened by Anthony's observation, which absolutely matches with mine and the commentary of engagement with people of all faiths, that they see themselves in this platform, that people of faith see the things that they believe in, the kind of society informed by their religious and world perspective is something that they can absolutely see in every chapter of this platform. And I think one issue that really matters is the increase in terrible vilification that's happened in Australia in recent times. And it's widely reported, particularly in communities of faith, whether they're communities of Christian faith or the Jewish faith, and the increase in security that has to be provided at schools, particularly Islamic and Jewish schools. So amongst the things that Labor has advanced in our draft platform is that a clear expression of our belief that no Australian should ever be vilified or subject to violence or threats or violence because of their religion or their religious beliefs. We want to advance anti-vilification laws that are fit for purpose. Labor made it very, very clear from the beginning of this period of government under Mr Morrison that when he claimed to the Australian people that he would develop a bipartisan piece of legislation, that we were absolutely up for the conversation of having bipartisan conversations around religious freedom laws and anti-vilification laws for people of faith as well, in the context of a cosmopolitan democracy. This can be achieved. It's not a bridge too far for us to be able to create legislation that gives protection and space for the fullness of views that are manifest in our society, from people of deep and committed faith to any particular tradition, to people who have completely no faith at all, and in fact might be strident atheists. The laws of our land need to actually meet that community reality and provide a space in which safe movement of thoughts, voice, and person through the society is enabled. We can do that. Now, what disappoints me, and I think it's important, and I'm hoping that through this podcast, the opportunity to get this out clearly might be actually become reality. Mr Morrison made a very, very important claim to the Australian people that he would approach legislating for religious freedom in a bipartisan way. What we've seen so far under the leadership of Mr Porter, who's had responsibility to date for this bill, was no consultation at all with the Labor Party as a party of government, and to the best of my knowledge, not with any other political party or even the independents. And we saw the first draft legislation delivered at a gathering at the Great Synagogue in Sydney. I'm vitally interested in this. I had to go and find that draft document along with every other Australian who had any interest on the internet. No one in Labor was consulted before that happened. That is not an indication of bipartisanship. It was followed up with a period of consultation. There were 6,000 or 7,000 submissions to that consultation between the first and the second draft. When the second draft landed, sadly, none of those, or a very, very small number of those submissions have ever been made public. I can't understand, if you're Mr Morrison, you say this is going to be bipartisan and it's important to the country, why, and so many Australians are interested in, why wouldn't you make this as public and as engaging a process for as many participants, both amongst the civil society and also amongst your colleagues in Parliament who continue to express interest? But that didn't happen, and we got the second draft delivered. And people who listen to your podcast are probably pretty tuned into what's been going on in this space. And I think people of faith have a right to be disappointed at this point of time that in reality, Mr Morrison has not at all been true to his word, that this piece of legislation in its two drafts has not been created in a bipartisan way. Now, historical events are overtaking Mr. Morrison's front bench, and there may be a change of leadership with regard to the Attorney General. Certainly, Senator Stoker has been co-opted into an assistant role. I've had many conversations with her, and it was a matter of public record after estimates the other day that I asked her about the possibility of bipartisanship with regard to advancing this piece of legislation. And I have to say that I think both Senator Stoker and I have the will to generally advance this in a way that would lead to a harmonious development of legislation that takes into account the full breadth of views across this nation and produces legislation that all Australians are able to live with, not only to live with, but to thrive in, people of faith and people of no faith. We can do that. Now, it will be up to whoever is the Attorney General as this matter progresses, and Labor's Attorney General Shadow Minister, Mr. Dreyfus, to undertake this conversation. And I can absolutely say that Labor has stood ready the entire time. Mr. Dreyfus, a man of faith himself, in the Jewish tradition, absolutely understands the importance of getting this legislation right. So I have to say, on the public record, this bill, or a bill of some form that addresses concerns and gives voice to religious freedom in a way that meets Australia's needs today, is a possibility with goodwill between the government of the day, the Liberal National Party, and its leadership, if they advance in the way that Mr. Morrison indicated at the beginning, in a bipartisan way. That journey forward from this day needs to look quite different, very different from the journey that has been undertaken so far. And Labor could not make it any clearer, and has on many occasions over the course of discussions with regard to religious freedom since the 2019 election and Mr. Morrison's return as Prime Minister. Labor has made it very, very clear that we deeply understand that the freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief, or change a religion or belief, or not to have or adopt a religion or belief, is absolute. And that legislation that deals with that in a way that meets the requirements of Australians in 2021 and going forward is a task that the Australian Labor Party is not only up for, but a task that we seek an invitation to undertake alongside the government, because across the parties there are people of deep and abiding faith and people of no faith who understand how important this is. And we can do this together. My greatest fear is that in the same way that this became a partisan political tool, that it could become that again for the next federal election. And I don't think people of faith see any benefit in more culture wars about religion. We need the fullness of our right to practice our faiths to be absolutely assured. And we also need people of no faith to feel no threat from that, and to have a really deep and rich understanding about the benefits of a democracy that is diverse. That's the conversation that needs to be led in the public place. That's what a real leader will enable, a harmonious, unifying conversation amongst people with the breadth of perspectives that is the Australian polity. And I believe that can be achieved. I hope that it will be achieved as a person of faith in the Labor tradition, who clearly has been impacted by the historical memory of what happened to the Jewish people in the course of the Second World War. And I cannot leave the memory of those 6 million lives behind. It's not a moment of history that we should forget. It's something that we should keep alive in our souls, and to use that knowledge and understanding of how hate around religion can break apart societies, and we must protect against that. We have to move to more harmony and less division.
Senator O'Neill, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for speaking with me today on Talking Freely.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. And I send my blessings and good thoughts and prayers to all your listeners.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.